Arizona Territory summer, 1883. The white mare's nostrils flared as she pressed against Sahali's weathered palm, her breath forming brief clouds in the scorching noon air. White Cloud had wandered from the creek again, drawn by some instinct her Apache master couldn't name. The lean scout, 30 years weathered by desert winds, followed her toward the gaping mouth of the coal dust mine. His buckskin shirt dark with perspiration, and his leather headband securing a single eagle feather that caught the harsh light. "What troubles you, girl?" he murmured in the careful cadence of one who spoke English as his second tongue, though Apache words felt more natural on his lips. White Cloud's ears swiveled forward, and she lowered her great head toward what appeared to be discarded canvas at the timber frame's base. The shadow resolved into a woman's crumpled form, blonde hair matted with grit-torn chemise, revealing rope burns across scraped shoulders and skin bearing the papery texture of severe dehydration. Sahale dropped to one knee, his trained gaze cataloging injuries with clinical precision. The shallow gash along her ribs had clotted but needed cleaning. Her white-knuckled fists clutched objects she refused to release even in unconsciousness, something that spoke of desperate purpose rather than random misfortune. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of spring grass after rain. Most whites in this territory regarded Apache faces with suspicion or outright terror. But this woman studied him with an intelligence that cut through obvious pain, assessing rather than fearing. Something flickered in her expression, a momentary confusion that seemed deeper than simple disorientation from injury. "Who?" she began, then winced as the words scraped her parched throat like broken glass. "Easy now," Sahale said softly, reaching for his water pouch. "You breathe steady. I'll get you something to drink." As she lifted the water to her lips, her movements held an unexpected grace. Most white women he'd encountered moved with the careful restraint their society demanded. But she tilted her head back and drank with an unconscious efficiency that spoke of harder times, survival learned rather than taught. White Cloud nickered and rested her massive head across the woman's lap, a gesture of protection. And the mare offered only to injured foals. The woman's right hand uncurled to stroke the horse's neck, with surprising gentleness, revealing a brass blasting cap, with its fuse cut short, DuPont manufacturing, imported and expensive. "This yours?" Sahale asked, holding up the device. She stared at the cap for a long moment, her brow furrowed as if trying to recall something just beyond reach. I think so." There was powder everywhere, the smell burning my nose. Her voice carried traces of an accent he couldn't place, not quite Eastern, not quite Southern, but something that suggested many places and many voices in her past. The rifle shot cracked from the rim rock above, like thunder chipping stone mere inches from Sahale's ear. He grabbed the woman's shoulders and rolled her behind White Cloud's bulk, his Winchester 1873 appearing in his hands with fluid precision, born of years surviving in lawless territory. 2 more shots rang out, poorly aimed but determined. Sahale answered with a single round that sent rock chips flying from the shooter's position, eliciting curses in English, punctuated by the drum of retreating hoofbeats. "They knew your location," he said, helping her sit upright against White Cloud's steady flank. Her left hand still clutched something torn paper with writing too small to decipher from this angle. "Someone abandoned you here to die, but now they're aware you survived." As he lifted her to check for additional injuries, their gazes locked for a heartbeat longer than necessity demanded. Up close, he could see faint marks along her temple scars, so old they were nearly invisible, but shaped like the kind of restraints used in the government schools where they tried to beat Indian children into white submission. The thought sent an unexpected chill through him. Those schools were hundreds of miles away, and this woman was clearly white despite her unusual comfort with hardship. But something about those scars, combined with the way she moved and the strange accent in her voice, planted seeds of unease in his mind. "Can you manage to ride?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. She nodded, though her grip on his forearm revealed how much the simple movement cost her. "My name is Cora," she whispered. "I remember a wagon, men dragging me, then darkness and the smell of gunpowder." Sahele glanced at the blasting cap in her palm, then at the mine entrance behind them. Coal dust had been worked aggressively for 3 years, but lately night shifts grew longer while day crews dwindled. Water tables dropped as the mine expanded, and game had grown scarce as operations disturbed ancient migration routes. "We need to move," he said, scanning the ridge where their attackers had vanished. "They'll return with reinforcements." As he helped Cora to her feet, he noticed how she favored her left side and instinctively leaned against his shoulder for support. But more unsettling was the way she fell silent and held her breath when a hawk cried overhead, the automatic stillness of someone who'd learned to hide from danger in the wild, not the fearful freeze of a sheltered woman. White Cloud knelt to ease, mounting another display of unusual acceptance. Sahale swung up first, then pulled Cora up behind him, her arms circling his waist as she settled against his back. When movement jarred her injured ribs, she made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath, the kind of pain tolerance that spoke of experience with suffering. "Hold tight," he instructed, guiding her hands to secure purchase on his belt. "Try not to think about the consequences of falling." Despite her pain, he heard a soft laugh. "Is that your idea of reassurance?" The humor caught him off guard. Most white women would be weeping or fainting by now, not making jokes while fleeing for their lives. Everything about her defied his expectations, creating questions he couldn't answer and suspicions he didn't want to voice. As they rode toward Willow Springs' distant cluster of adobe and timber buildings, Cora's body gradually relaxed against his back. The trust implicit in her posture stirred something protective within him, dangerous territory for someone who'd learned to depend only on himself and his horse. But when she began murmuring softly behind him, the words made his blood run cold. She was speaking Apache fragmentary phrases about water and safety, spoken with the pronunciation of a child who'd learned the language naturally rather than from books. Her voice held the rhythm of someone who'd once been fluent, though she seemed unaware of what language she was using. "Where did you learn Apache words?" he asked carefully, his voice barely audible over White Cloud's hoofbeats. "What?" Cora lifted her head from his shoulder. "I wasn't speaking Apache. I don't know any Indian languages." The torn paper crackled against his shirt, where she held it pressed between them. Whatever information that fragment contained had motivated men to attempt murder. But now Sahale wondered if there were secrets even deeper than mining fraud at stake. Willow Springs wavered in heat shimmer ahead. Buildings clustered around the county courthouse like chicks seeking shelter. Smoke rose from the stamp mill at town's edge, processing ore from coal dust, and smaller claims scattered across the region. He guided White Cloud toward Dr. Caroline Finch's clinic, one of the few establishments where his money carried weight. The Boston-trained physician had scandalized the territory by refusing marriage and practicing medicine with a loaded Colt single-action army revolver in her desk drawer. But she asked fewer questions than most, and her word carried weight with territorial authorities. "Those men," Cora said as they approached the clinic, her grip tightening on his belt. "They weren't complete strangers. I've seen them before, though I can't recall where." "Memory returns with rest and proper food." Sahale replied, though privately he wondered if her forgotten past might prove more dangerous than helpful. The scars on her temples, the way she moved the Apache words she'd spoken, without realizing all pointed toward experiences no white woman should have endured. As they dismounted, Cora stumbled, and Sahale caught her elbow. The contact sent awareness racing through him, despite the circumstances, making him reluctant to release her arm, even when she'd regained her balance. Dr. Caroline Finch emerged from her clinic, graying hair pinned severely back and her dark dress chosen for function over fashion. She assessed Cora's condition with a single sharp glance, noting details that would have escaped most observers. "Inside immediately," she commanded. "And next time, bring her before the sun finishes what men started." But as Sahale helped Cora through the doorway, he caught Dr. Caroline's sharp look of recognition. The physician had seen those temple scars before, probably on other survivors of the government schools. The realization that his suspicions might be correct sent ice through his veins. If Cora was Apache by birth, raised white by force, then everything about their situation became infinitely more complicated and dangerous. Dr. Caroline's clinic occupied a sturdy adobe building's ground floor, thick walls providing blessed relief from desert heat. The physician worked with efficient precision, while Sahale waited in the outer room. Winchester 1873, propped within easy reach, and his attention split between the door and the partition separating him from Cora's treatment. Through thin walls, he heard Dr. Caroline's gentle interrogation and Cora's halting responses. Memory fragments emerged like puzzle pieces, a freight wagon bound east, creaking wheels. Men's voices raised in heated argument. Then hands seizing her a blow to the head, awakening in darkness, with explosive residue burning her nostrils. "This scarring along your temples," Dr. Caroline said carefully. "Do you remember how you acquired these marks?" "No." Cora replied, confusion evident in her voice. "I've had them as long as I can remember. My guardian said I fell from a horse as a child." Sahale's jaw tightened. Those weren't riding accident scars, they were restraint marks from the metal bands used to immobilize children during educational correction at government schools. The lies Cora had been told about her past suggested a deliberate effort to erase her origins. "Hold steady," Dr. Caroline instructed. "This will sting, but the wound requires thorough cleaning." Sahale heard Cora's controlled breathing as the physician worked, noting how she managed pain without crying out. When fever began rising from infection, she started murmuring again, this time in Apache phrases that made his hands shake. "Tonihi Shima. Tonihi. Water hurts, mother. Water hurts." The words hit him like physical blows. He knew that voice, though it had been 15 years since he'd heard it. 15 years since soldiers had taken his cousin Ayanna from their winter camper, dragging away a green-eyed child who'd begged for water as they loaded her onto a wagon with other stolen Apache children. But Ayanna was dead. The mission school had reported her death from influenza within months of her arrival. He'd mourned her, carried guilt for failing to protect her, spent years searching for her grave without success. Yet the woman in the next room spoke. With Ayanna's voice, moved with unconscious grace his cousin had possessed, and bore scars that matched reports from other survivors of the schools. "Shikehago Nadli," Cora whispered in fevered delirium. "Brother, help me walk." The childhood name she'd called him struck like lightning. Sahale gripped his rifle to keep his hands from trembling, torn between desperate hope and fear that his longing was creating impossible fantasies. The door opened to admit Leonora Pratt, carrying clean garments. The schoolteacher was 35, with prematurely silver hair and the determined chin of someone who'd fought numerous battles for her students' welfare. She nodded to Sahale with the respect she'd shown since he'd returned 3 lost children after a flash flood the previous spring. "How is she faring?" Leonora asked, setting down the clothes. "Alive, thanks to White Cloud's instincts." Sahale replied, his voice carefully controlled. "The fever's breaking, but she's been speaking in her sleep." "What language?" Sahali hesitated, weighing the dangers of truth against the necessity of understanding. Apache. Words a child would know, family terms, requests for help. Leonora's expression sharpened with sudden comprehension. There were rumors about the coal dust mines workforce. Bruno Kettering supposedly employed clerks from the territorial school system, but nobody ever saw them in town. The implications crystallized with horrible clarity. If Kettering was using Apache children stolen from schools as unpaid labor, keeping them isolated and dependent, it would explain both the mine's unusual profitability and the extreme measures taken to silence anyone who discovered the operation. She might not be the only one. Leonora continued quietly. Other children could still be trapped there, hidden from inspection, and worked like slaves. The inner door opened, revealing Dr. Caroline escorting Cora, who now wore a clean white blouse and dark skirt that made her blonde hair seem to capture lamplight. The physician had bandaged her ribs and cleaned the worst scratches, but Cora still moved carefully, protecting her left side. Up close with fever, flushed from her cheeks, and clean clothes revealing her natural coloring, and the resemblance to his lost cousin was unmistakable. The same green eyes, the same stubborn chin, even the same small scar on her left hand from a childhood accident they'd shared. Cracked rib, fortunately not broken, Dr. Caroline reported. She needs rest, nourishment, and time for memories to sort themselves properly. Cora extended her hand toward Sahali, revealing the objects she'd clutched throughout her ordeal. The blasting cap bore distinctive DuPont markings, but the torn paper fragment showed something more: troubling columns of figures in careful clerk's handwriting, with notations about workers identified only by numbers rather than names. I'm beginning to remember why I possessed these, Cora said, her voice gaining strength. I was working at the mine copying figures for shipping records, but the numbers didn't match what I observed: too much ore for the workers they claimed to employ. Sahali studied the paper fragment, noting details that painted a horrifying picture. If workers were identified by numbers rather than names, if shipping weights exceeded official workforce records, then Kettering was operating something far worse than simple tax fraud. How many workers did you see? He asked carefully. Difficult to say. They kept us separated, worked different shifts. Cora paused, confusion flickering across her features. Us. Why did I say us? I was the only clerk there. But her unconscious slip revealed the truth. She'd been part of a group of captive workers, her memories of the others buried beneath whatever psychological trauma had helped her survive years of imprisonment. A soft hissing sound from outside made Sahali tense with recognition. Fuse burning toward blasting powder, he'd heard that sound in too many battles to mistake it for anything else. Everyone down, he commanded, grabbing Cora and pushing her behind Dr. Caroline's desk, while simultaneously diving toward the clinic's rear window. The fuse protruded from beneath a rain barrel beside the building's side wall. Sahali smothered it with bare hands and mud the partially burned hemp crumbling in his fingers as he calculated how close they'd come to death. They're watching, he muttered, scanning gathering darkness through the window. Waiting to see our response. When he turned back to the room, he found Cora standing perfectly still beside the overturned desk, her body positioned in the corner, where shadows provided maximum concealment. The posture was automatic, unconscious, exactly how Apache children were taught to hide from enemies. Is it over? She asked, her voice barely audible. The immediate danger, yes. Sahali replied, though his mind raced with larger implications. But they'll return with more men and better planning. Dr. Caroline checked her pistol's load with practiced efficiency. If they're bold enough to bomb my clinic, they won't hesitate to attack wherever we take her next. Sahali found himself studying Cora's face in the lamplight, noting similarities to his lost cousin that went beyond physical resemblance. The way she held herself despite injuries, the unconscious competence with which she'd taken cover, even the rhythm of her breathing, all spoke of training he'd provided to a green-eyed child 15 years ago. "You could leave town entirely," he suggested, carefully testing her reaction. "Catch tomorrow morning's freight to Silver Falls, begin fresh somewhere safer. Running won't prevent them from murdering the next person who discovers their secret." Cora replied with familiar stubbornness. "Besides, I lack money for passage, and I'm not the sort of woman who abandons a fight." The determination in her voice completed the recognition. This was Ayanna, grown into the woman she should have become if soldiers hadn't stolen her childhood. But how could he tell her the truth when she'd been trained to forget everything Apache about herself? "The mine operates night shifts 3 times weekly," he said, decision crystallizing. "If we can observe their actual operations, we might understand the full scope of what they're hiding." As they prepared to leave the clinic under cover of darkness, Sahale wrestled with knowledge that changed everything. The woman he'd been drawn to protect wasn't a stranger, she was family, the lost child he'd mourned for 15 years. But she was also the woman who'd captured his heart before he'd recognized her, creating complications he didn't know how to resolve. The immediate danger demanded all his attention. But underlying everything was a deeper question. How do you tell someone they're not who they think they are, especially when the truth might destroy them? Deadeye. Dick Callahan led his men through desert darkness with the confidence of someone who knew the territory intimately. The 3 gunmen had been hired for their reputation with violence, but tonight they carried instructions more specific than simple murder. "Boss wants the woman alive for questioning." Deadeye reminded his companions as they approached Dr. Caroline's clinic. "But the Apache dies tonight, along with anyone else who gets in our way." Smooth Sam Boyle nodded, checking his pistol's action one final time. "What about the doctor and that school teacher they've seen too much to let them walk away?" "Accidents happen," Deadeye replied with cold satisfaction. "Especially when people interfere with business they don't understand." From his concealment behind the livery stable, Sahale watched the gunmen position themselves around the clinic's exits. Their movements were professional, coordinated, designed to prevent escape rather than simply kill from ambush. Whatever information Cora possessed, they needed her alive to extract it. But Sahale had spent the afternoon preparing for exactly this kind of assault. Ropes secured to second-story windows, horses positioned at multiple locations, weapons cached at strategic points throughout the town. If Deadeye wanted a hunt, he'd get one. The attack began with a thrown torch through the clinic's front window, followed immediately by gunfire, aimed to drive occupants toward the rear exit, where stuttering Stan waited in ambush. But the building was empty, except for strategically placed straw-stuffed coats, propped like men dressed in spare clothing. "It's a trap," Deadeye shouted, spinning toward the sound of breaking glass from the opposite direction. Sahale's first shot took Smooth Sam in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into darkness. The second shot shattered the lantern Deadeye was using for illumination, plunging the area into confusion. But these weren't ordinary criminals. Deadeye and his men had fought in range wars and territorial disputes, learning to coordinate under fire with deadly efficiency. Within seconds, they'd taken cover and begun returning accurate fire toward Sahale's muzzle flashes. "Where's the woman?" Deadeye called out, his voice carrying clearly through the night. "We know she's here somewhere, Apache. Make this easy on everyone and hand her over." Sahale's answer was another rifle shot that chipped stone inches from Deadeye's position. But the gunman had already moved, using the sound to triangulate Sahale's location while his companions maneuvered for better angles. The running battle that followed led through Willow Springs' main street and into the maze of alleys behind the commercial district. Sahale used terrain and darkness to his advantage, but three determined killers with good tactical sense posed a serious threat, even to someone with his skills. When stuttering Stan managed to get between Sahale and his nearest cached weapon, the situation became desperate. The gunman's speech impediment vanished entirely when he held a loaded pistol replaced by cold competence that had ended many lives. "Got you now, Apache." Stan said, his gun steady despite the excitement in his voice. "Boss'll pay good money for your scalp even if the woman ain't with you." The shot that ended Stan's threat came from an unexpected direction. Cora stepped from concealment 20 yards away, Dr. Caroline's spare revolver smoking in her steady hands. Her shot had taken Stan through the heart with precision that spoke of considerable practice with firearms. "How?" Sahale began. But gunfire from Deadeye and Smooth Sam cut off the question. "Later," Cora said, taking cover beside him behind an overturned wagon. "Right now, we need to reach the horses before they surround us completely." As they moved through shadows toward the predetermined escape route, Sahale found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about his companion. The way she moved through darkness, the competence with which she'd eliminated Stan, and the tactical awareness she displayed all suggested training far beyond what any white woman would possess. But there was no time for questions. Deadeye had regrouped with reinforcements, and the sound of approaching hoofbeats meant more trouble was arriving from the direction of the mine. White Cloud waited in the arroyo north of town, saddled and ready with supplies for extended flight. But as Sahale helped Cora mount behind him, she caught his arm with surprising strength. "There are others," she said urgently, her voice carrying new certainty. "At the mine. Children who've been there for years, worked like animals, and kept hidden from inspections. We can't run and leave them to die." "How do you know this?" Sahale asked, though he suspected the answer would confirm his growing certainty about her identity. "I remember now," Cora said, her voice breaking with recovered pain. "Not everything, but enough. I was there for 3 years before they moved me to lighter duties. There are maybe a dozen others still underground, some who've never seen sunlight since they were taken." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Not only was his cousin alive, but she'd endured years of captivity and forced labor while he'd searched fruitlessly for her grave. The guilt was crushing, but it also provided clarity about what needed to be done. "Then we go back," he said simply. "Tonight, while they're distracted hunting us here in town." As they rode toward the mine through desert darkness, Cora pressed close against his back for warmth and security. But now, Sahale was acutely aware of every point of contact torn between the protective love he'd always felt for his lost cousin and the deeper attraction that had developed before he'd recognized her. The emotional complexity was staggering. How could he reconcile 15 years of grief with present desire? How could he tell her the truth about their relationship without destroying the bond they'd forged as strangers? More immediately, how could they rescue a dozen captive children from a heavily guarded mine while avoiding the manhunt that would certainly follow their escape from town? "Sahale," Cora said quietly as they approached the mine's perimeter. "Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that finding you was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me." The simple statement cut straight through his emotional confusion. Lucky or not destined or coincidental, they were here together, facing impossible odds to save innocent lives. Everything else could wait until the children were free. "Stay close," he said, dismounting at the edge of lamplight spilling from the mine's entrance. "And be ready to run if things go badly." But as they approached the guards posted outside the mine shaft, Sahale realized that running might not be an option. Too many lives depended on success, and some battles had to be fought regardless of the odds. The coal dust mine's night shift operated with clockwork precision guards rotating every 2 hours, while wagons loaded with human cargo departed through carefully concealed routes. Bruno Kettering supervised operations personally, his thick German accent cutting through the darkness as he directed workers with the casual brutality of a man who viewed other humans as livestock. From their concealment in broken rocks above the main entrance, Sahale and Cora observed the systematic horror unfolding below. Children emerged from the mine shaft in chains, their faces bearing the hollow expressions of those who'd given up hope years ago. Most appeared to be Apache, though a few looked like they might be from other tribes scattered across the territory. She spoke in her people's tongue. She spoke in her people's tongue. One of the children whispered to another in Apache. "Hello, my relative." Cora's sharp intake of breath beside him revealed that she understood the words, even if she couldn't consciously remember learning the language. Her buried memories were surfacing under stress, bringing back fragments of the childhood that had been stolen from her. "I know that boy," she said, pointing to a thin child who couldn't have been more than 14 despite years of hard labor. "His name is..." She spoke in her people's tongue, Yaji. "Little man. He's been there since he was 8 years old." The fact that she remembered his Apache name rather than whatever the mine operators called him confirmed what Sahale already suspected. Deep down beneath layers of forced forgetting and deliberate miseducation, Ayana was still there. "How many guards?" he asked, forcing himself to focus on tactical necessities. 6 outside, maybe 4 more underground supervising the work crews, plus Kettering and his foreman Sergei. Cora studied the compound with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years learning every detail of her prison. But there's something else. Commissioner Pike arrives every midnight to inspect operations personally. This was valuable intelligence. If Pike was personally involved in supervising the child labor operation, it meant the conspiracy reached the highest levels of territorial government. But it also meant they'd have a brief window of opportunity when authority figures were concentrated in one location. The children sleep in a converted powder magazine about 50 yards behind the main shaft. Cora continued. Stonewall's single entrance guarded around the clock. But the guards change at midnight, and there's always a few minutes when... She stopped speaking abruptly, her face going pale in the moonlight. Following her gaze, Sahale saw a familiar figure approaching the mine entrance on horseback. Commissioner Cornelius Pike, accompanied by Sheriff Maximilian Pike and a small escort of deputies. "They're early tonight," Cora whispered. "Something's wrong." Pike's voice carried clearly in the still air as he dismounted and strode toward Kettering with obvious agitation. "Have you found them yet? The Apache and the woman?" "My men are searching Willow Springs," Kettering replied nervously. "But if they escaped into the desert..." "They didn't escape anywhere," Pike interrupted harshly. "They're planning something, and I want them found before they can act on it." Sahale felt the cold certainty of recognition settle over him. This wasn't random paranoia. Pike somehow knew they were planning a rescue attempt. Either someone had betrayed them, or their earlier reconnaissance had been detected. "Shike." Cora breathed beside him, unconsciously using the Apache word for brother. "They know we're here." The slip confirmed his suspicions completely, but there was no time to process the emotional implications. Armed men were spreading out from the mine entrance, beginning a systematic search of the surrounding area with military precision. "We need to move now," Sahale said, checking his rifle's action, "before they can organize a proper hunt." But as they prepared to descend toward the converted magazine where the children were held, Cora caught his arm with desperate strength. "Wait," she said urgently, her voice carrying new remembrance. "There's something I haven't told you about the mine's layout. The children aren't just prisoners, they're also the workforce for something else Pike's been hiding." "What kind of something?" "An illegal smelting operation. He's not just stealing ore from coal dust, he's processing high-grade silver from claims all across the territory using child labor to work operations that would be impossible to hide with adult employees." The scope of the conspiracy suddenly became clear. This wasn't just about one mine or even one county. Pike was running a territory-wide silver theft operation using stolen Apache children as slave labor because they could be worked to death without anyone in the white community asking questions about their disappearance. But the smelting operation also meant the underground complex was larger and more heavily defended than Sahale had realized. Rescuing the children would require fighting through multiple levels of security, with the added danger of toxic fumes and explosive materials stored throughout the facility. "How many children total?" he asked. 14 that I knew of 3 months ago. But they bring in new ones regularly, and..." Her voice broke with remembered horror. "And they work them until they die. The cemetery behind the old shaft has more graves than you can count." The systematic murder of Apache children struck Sahale like a physical blow. These weren't just criminals, they were conducting genocide for profit, destroying entire families while maintaining the facade of legitimate territorial administration. "Then we end this tonight," he said with quiet finality. "All of it." As lantern light began sweeping the rocky slopes around their position, Sahale made rapid calculations about timing ammunition and the terrible arithmetic of rescue missions, where failure meant death for everyone involved. The children would be held in the most secure part of the complex, surrounded by guards and with limited escape routes. But the smelting operation also meant there would be stored explosives, dangerous chemicals, and structural weaknesses that could be exploited by someone with the right knowledge and desperate courage. Cora was already moving, sliding down the rocky slope toward the mine complex, with the fluid grace of someone who knew every stone and shadow. Her recovered memories were guiding her movements, bringing back skills and knowledge she'd been forced to suppress during years of captivity. "This way," she whispered, leading him toward a concealed entrance she'd observed during her time as a prisoner. The ventilation shaft connects to the magazine, but it's too small for adults to use regularly. As they approached the hidden entrance, Sahale realized the terrible irony of their situation. He'd found his lost cousin after 15 years of searching, only to discover that saving her would require risking both their lives in a battle against impossible odds. But some bonds transcended rational calculation, and some evils demanded opposition regardless of the cost. Tonight, he would either free the children Pike had stolen or die trying. Everything else, including the emotional complexity of loving someone he'd raised like a sister, would have to wait until the children were safe. The ventilation shaft descended into darkness that seemed to swallow their small torch like water extinguishing flame. Cora led the way through passages carved from living rock, her movements sure, despite 3 months' absence from the underground maze. The air grew thicker as they descended, heavy with the smell of chemicals and human suffering. "Stay quiet here," she whispered, pressing against the wall beside a junction where 2 passages met. "Guard station just ahead, usually 2 men, but they change every hour." Sahale checked his pocket watch by the flickering torchlight. 11:30 minutes until Pike's usual inspection would bring additional security to the area. They needed to reach the children and begin extraction before the changing of the guard complicated their escape. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze against the rough stone walls. 2 guards passed their hiding place, speaking in low voices about the search operations above ground. "Boss is worried," one was saying. "Never seen Pike this worked up about anything. He's talking about shutting down the whole operation, moving everything to the Sonora facility. What about the kids? What do you think can't have witnesses walking around talking about what they've seen down here? The casual discussion of mass murder sent rage burning through Sahale's veins, but he forced himself to remain still until the voices faded into distance. When they finally moved forward, Cora's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers cold but steady. Almost there. She breathed, guiding him through a narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber. The converted magazine was exactly as she'd described: stone walls, single entrance, and a heavy wooden door secured with multiple locks. But inside, barely visible through cracks in the ancient timber, they could see the children. 14 souls ranging in age, from perhaps 8 to 16, all bearing the hollow expressions and physical marks of systematic abuse. Most appeared to be Apache, though Sahale recognized features that suggested Navajo Pueblo and other tribal origins among Pike's victims. The youngest child was curled in the corner, whimpering softly in Apache. Shima Shima Haida Nadli. Mother, mother, when can I walk home? Sahale felt his heart break at the plaintive question. How many children had asked the same thing before dying in Pike's underground hell? How many families had mourned children who'd simply vanished without explanation? But Cora had moved past emotional reaction to practical necessity. She was examining the door's lock mechanism with the focused attention of someone who'd studied every detail of her prison during years of captivity. 3 locks, but the keys hang on a ring just inside the guard station, she whispered. I can reach them if you can create a distraction. What kind of distraction? Something that draws both guards away from their post for at least 5 minutes. Sahale nodded, understanding the tactical requirements. The ventilation system would carry sound throughout the underground complex, which meant any distraction would also alert every guard in the facility to their presence. Once we free them, how do we get 14 children through those passages to the surface? We don't, Cora replied grimly. The main shaft is the only exit large enough for a group that size. We'll have to fight our way out through the primary entrance. It was a desperate plan, with almost no chance of success. But the alternative was leaving the children to die when Pike decided to eliminate all witnesses to his operations. Some battles had to be fought, regardless of odds. Give me 10 minutes to reach the powder stores, Sahale said, checking his weapons one final time. When you hear the explosion, move fast for those keys. But as he prepared to leave, her Cora caught his arm with surprising strength. Sahale, she said urgently, her voice carrying an intensity that cut through tactical planning. If something happens to me, promise you'll get the children out. Promise me they won't die because we failed. Nothing's going to happen to you, he replied, though they both knew the promise was impossible to keep. Promise me. She insisted, her green eyes reflecting torchlight with desperate intensity. I promise, he said, meaning it completely. But you're going to survive this, and so are they. We didn't find each other after all these years, just to die in Pike's underground hell. The powder magazine was located deeper in the complex, past guard stations, and through areas where the illegal smelting operation filled the air with toxic fumes. Sahale moved through shadows like smoke, using skills learned in a dozen territorial conflicts to avoid detection. When he reached the explosive storage, the extent of Pike's criminal empire became fully clear. Crates of dynamite, blasting caps, and mining charges filled the chamber, enough explosive power to level half of Willow Springs if detonated simultaneously. But Pike's operation was more sophisticated than simple mining fraud. Documents stored in a fireproof safe revealed the true scope of the conspiracy, a territory-wide network of illegal claims, stolen children, and systematic genocide designed to clear Apache lands for mining operations backed by Eastern capital. The realization that he was looking at evidence of planned extermination of his entire people sent cold fury through Sahali's veins. This wasn't just about rescuing 14 children. It was about preventing the systematic murder of every Apache family in the territory. He set charges with careful precision, creating maximum damage while allowing time for escape. The explosion would bring down this section of the mine and destroy Pike's smelting operation. But more importantly, it would create enough chaos to cover their escape with the children. As he made final preparations, footsteps echoed from the passage behind him. Multiple men moving with military precision toward his position. They'd been discovered. "Yoi Yaji," a voice called in Apache. "Little warrior." The childhood nickname hit like lightning. Only one person had ever called him that, his cousin Ayana, when she'd been too small to pronounce his full name correctly. But Ayana was dead, had been dead for 15 years. Unless... Ayana. He called softly, the name tearing from his throat like a prayer. Shike. The Apache word for male cousin, spoken with joy and desperation, and 15 years of grief. I remember everything. But there was no time for reunion or explanation. The approaching footsteps were closer now, and the charges he'd set would detonate in less than 3 minutes. "Run!" he called in Apache. "Get the children and run for the main entrance." The explosion that followed brought down half the underground complex in a thunderous crash of stone and timber. Lanterns guttered out in the smoke failed throughout the facility, plunging Pike's operation into darkness and confusion. But in that darkness, two voices called to each other in the language of their childhood. The Apache warrior and his lost cousin finally reunited in the depths of hell. They would escape together or die trying. The main shaft became a battleground, as Pike's guards realized their carefully planned operation was collapsing around them. Lanterns guttered out in the smoke cast wild shadows on stone walls as 14 terrified children followed Cora and Sahale toward an uncertain escape. Deadeye Callahan and his surviving men had positioned themselves at the mine entrance, turning the only exit into a deadly bottleneck. But Sahale had fought in worse circumstances, and now he had more than just his own life to protect. "Stay behind the ore cart," he called to the children in Apache, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos. "When I say run, you run fast as mountain cats to the horses." The oldest boy, the one Cora had called Little Man, nodded with grim understanding. At 14, he'd already learned more about survival than most adults would ever know. The younger children clustered around him, instinctively recognizing leadership born from shared suffering. Commissioner Pike appeared at the shaft entrance, his expensive suit torn and his face blackened with smoke from the underground explosion. But his eyes held the cold rage of a man who'd seen his empire crumbling in a single night. "Bring me their heads," he commanded his remaining guards. "All of them. No witnesses, no survivors, no evidence that any of this ever existed." Smooth Sam Boyle, his wounded arm bound with rough bandages, raised his rifle toward the children with deadly intent. His shot would have taken Little Man in the chest if not for Cora's intervention. She threw herself forward, taking the bullet meant for the boy, while simultaneously drawing Pike's attention to her position. The wound spun her around and sent her crashing into the stone wall, but she kept moving, using her body to shield the younger children while Sahale engaged the gunmen with systematic precision. His first shot took Smooth Sam through the heart, ending the wounded killer's participation in Pike's genocide. The second shot shattered Deadeye's shooting hand, sending his rifle spinning into darkness while the gunman screamed in pain and rage. But Pike himself had drawn a silver-plated revolver, its barrel aimed directly at Cora's head with unwavering steadiness. Enough! He shouted, his voice echoing through the mine shaft. Everyone stops shooting or the woman dies right now. The standoff that followed stretched through seconds that felt like hours. Pike held all the tactical advantages, position cover, and a hostage whose life meant everything to Sahale's success. "Let the children go," Sahale called from his position behind the ore cart. "Your quarrel is with me, not with them. My quarrel is with anyone who threatens my operations." Pike replied coldly. "These children are property of the Territorial Mining Authority, assigned to work details according to federal Indian policy. They're human beings, not property. They're savages being civilized through productive labor," Pike said with the casual certainty of a man who'd convinced himself that genocide was a public service. "Their deaths will serve the greater good of territorial development." But as Pike spoke, Cora had been moving slowly along the wall, using shadows and debris to mask her approach. The bullet wound in her shoulder was bleeding freely, but she ignored the pain with the same determination that had carried her through years of captivity. When she struck, it was with the silent precision of a mountain cat. Her knife, taken from a dead guard's belt, slid between Pike's ribs with surgical accuracy, piercing his heart and ending his reign of terror in a single thrust. The commissioner collapsed without a sound, his silver revolver clattering across stone as his eyes went dark forever. "It's finished," Cora said in Apache, her voice carrying exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "The monster is dead, and we can finally go home." But the battle wasn't over. Deadeye, despite his wounded hand, had managed to light a fuse connected to explosives hidden throughout the mine shaft. If the charges detonated, they would bring down the entire entrance and trap everyone inside. "The fuse," Little Man shouted, pointing to the sputtering cord snaking toward a cache of blasting powder. "We have maybe 2 minutes." Sahale dove toward the burning fuse, but Deadeye's position allowed him to cover the explosives with deadly crossfire. Any attempt to reach the charges would be suicide. That's when White Cloud arrived. The mare had somehow found her way into the mine shaft, following her master's scent through smoke and chaos with the loyalty that had defined their partnership for years. She charged directly at Deadeye, her hooves striking sparks from stone as she bore down on the wounded killer. Deadeye's shot went wide as White Cloud's shoulder caught him in the chest, driving him backward into the stone wall with bone-crushing force. But the distraction cost precious seconds from their escape time. Sahale reached the fuse with heartbeats to spare, smothering it with his bare hands, while Cora herded the children toward the mine entrance. Burns seared his palms, but the charges remained silent. As they emerged into desert starlight, 14 rescued children breathing free air. For the first time in years, Sahale finally allowed himself to believe they might survive the night. But the greatest revelation was yet to come. "Shike," Cora said, using the Apache term for male cousin as she settled against his shoulder. "Do you remember teaching me to track rabbits by the old cottonwood when I was 7 years old?" "Ayana," he whispered, finally allowing himself to speak the name he'd carried in his heart for 15 years. "I looked for you everywhere. They told me you died in the school." "They told me you were dead too," she replied, her voice breaking with recovered memory and shared grief. "They said our whole family had been killed by soldiers, that there was nothing left to go back to." The lies that had kept them apart for 15 years dissolved in the truth of recognition. But with understanding came new complexity. The love Sahale felt for this woman was deeper than family bonds, complicated by years of separation, and the attraction that had grown between them as strangers. "What happens now?" he asked, looking at the rescued children who waited nearby with patient hope. "First, we take them home," Ayana replied, using her recovered Apache name with growing confidence. Then we decide who we want to be, the people we became apart, or the family we were meant to be together. As they prepared horses for the journey to safety, Sahale realized that finding Ayana had been only the beginning of their story. The hardest part would be learning to love each other, not as the children they'd been, but as the adults they'd become through years of loss and survival. But some bonds transcended time and separation, and some love was strong enough to bridge any gap that circumstances created. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, beautiful and harsh and full of possibilities neither had dared to hope for during the dark years of their separation. But they were together now, with 14 saved lives riding beside them toward a future built on truth instead of lies. And that was enough to make any journey home worthwhile. Dawn painted the eastern peaks in shades of gold and crimson as their small caravan reached the hidden valley where free Apache people still lived according to the old ways. The children rode in exhausted silence, their faces beginning to show hope for the first time in years as familiar landscape welcomed them home. An old woman emerged from the traditional shelter at the valley's heart, her weathered face creasing with joy as she recognized faces she'd mourned as lost forever. "Ayana Yoi Yaji, you have come home at last." "Grandmother," Ayana said, sliding from her horse to embrace the elder who'd raised them both after their parents died. "We've brought the children home." But the reunion was complicated by more than just time and distance. Sahale watched Ayana struggle with memories that were returning in fragments, pieces of identity she'd been forced to forget, reassembling themselves slowly and sometimes painfully. "I don't remember how to speak properly," she confided as they sat beside the small fire that evening. "The words feel strange in my mouth, like I'm trying to speak underwater." "Language returns with practice," Sahale replied gently. "Like riding or tracking. The knowledge is still there, just buried under years of forced forgetting." As the rescued children began sharing their stories with the tribal elders, the full scope of Pike's genocide became clear. Dozens of families had lost children to his operations over the years, entire bloodlines systematically destroyed for the profit of men who saw Apache people as obstacles to territorial development. But there was also healing in the telling. Names that had been forbidden were spoken aloud again. Traditional songs that hadn't been heard in years filled the valley with music of memory and mourning and hope. "Tell me about before," Ayana said, as they walked together beside the stream that ran through the valley's heart. "I remember pieces, but not how they fit together." Sahale found himself sharing memories he'd carried alone for 15 years, her laughter when he'd taught her to use a sling, her stubborn determination to keep up with older boys during hunting lessons, her tears when she'd fallen from a horse and broken her arm. "You called me Yoi Yaji because you couldn't pronounce my real name," he said, smiling at the recollection. "Little warrior, because you said I fought like someone much bigger. And you called me Ayana Yaji, little forever girl, because you said I asked too many questions that would take forever to answer." The shared memories were precious, but they also highlighted the complexity of their current relationship. The love Sahale felt for this woman transcended family bonds. But how could he express romantic feelings for someone he'd raised like a younger sister? "There's something I need to tell you," he said carefully as they paused beside a pool where water fell in silver streams over ancient rocks. "About why you tried to leave me in Willow Springs?" Ayana asked, her green eyes reflecting starlight with gentle understanding. "You remember?" "I remember feeling like my heart was being torn in half when you rode away," she said quietly. "I remember thinking that I'd finally found someone who saw me as more than just a victim or a problem to be solved. And then suddenly you were treating me like a stranger." Sahale struggled with words that seemed inadequate for the emotions churning in his chest. When I began to recognize you, when I realized you were the cousin I'd mourned for 15 years, I didn't know what to feel. The love I felt for you as Cora seemed wrong if you were Ayanna. And now I know that you're both, he said, reaching for her hands in the darkness. You're the child I helped raise, and the woman I fell in love with, and somehow those don't contradict each other the way I thought they would. Ayanna stepped closer, her face tilted up toward his, with an expression that mixed memory with present desire. We're not the same people we were 15 years ago. The children who were separated are gone. We grew up apart, became different people, learned to survive in different worlds. So, what does that make us now? Adults who chose each other, she said simply. Not because of family obligations or childhood bonds, but because of who we became during the years we were apart. When they kissed, it was with the passion of two people who'd found each other across impossible distances and circumstances. But it was also gentle, reverent, colored by understanding of all they'd lost and gained during their separation. I love you, Sahale said against her lips, the words carrying weight of years and miles, and grief transformed into joy. I love you too, Ayanna replied. All of you, the boy who taught me to track the man who saved my life, the warrior who fought beside me, the cousin who never stopped looking for me, even when everyone said I was dead. As they held each other beside the sacred pool with starlight reflecting off water that had run clear through this valley for countless generations, both understood that their story was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, learning to live between two worlds, helping other stolen children find their way home, deciding whether to pursue justice for Pike's crimes through territorial courts or Apache traditions. But they would face those challenges together as partners and family and lovers, with the strength that came from surviving separation and finding each other again. The rescued children were settling into new lives, learning forgotten languages and customs from elders who'd kept the old ways alive during the darkest years of territorial oppression. Their healing would take time, but it would happen surrounded by people who understood their pain and shared their blood. And in the hidden valley where Apache people still lived free, two hearts that had recognized each other across years of loss finally came home to stay. The conspiracy that had brought them together was finished. The secrets that had separated them were revealed, and the future stretched ahead with possibilities neither had dared to dream during the dark years of their separation. But they were together now, and that was enough to make any journey worthwhile. As winter approached and the rescued children settled into their new lives with growing confidence, Sahale and Ayanna began planning their own future together. They would divide their time between the hidden valley and the outside world, serving as bridges between Apache traditions and the changing reality of territorial life. There were wrongs to be made right, other children to be found and brought home, and a society to be built that honored both worlds instead of demanding the destruction of one for the benefit of the other. But first, there was a wedding to plan, Apache traditions, combined with personal choices, celebrating not just the union of two hearts, but the healing of wounds that had seemed permanent just months before. The woman who'd been called Cora would keep that name when dealing with the white world, but among her people she was Ayanna, returned from the dead, and ready to help her community thrive despite all attempts to destroy it. The man who'd spent 15 years searching for his lost cousin had found something better than he'd dared hope for, a partner who shared his history and his dreams, someone strong enough to stand beside him in any battle that needed fighting. And in the high country where their ancestors had always been free, two survivors of genocide found love strong enough to overcome any obstacle that history or hatred could place in their path. Their story had begun with loss, and separation continued through years of searching and surviving, and would endure as long as there were people who believed that some bonds transcend time and circumstance. The desert would remember their names, and the mountains would echo with stories of the Apache warrior and his forever girl who found each other across the darkness and chose to build their future on love instead of loss.